All right, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time. You know, I listen to your work on a regular basis during the football week. So being able to unpack one of your books and just hopefully just life and career advice in general, I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it too. Thank you so much. Appreciate you having me.
Oh, likewise. One of the things I wanted to start off with, and this is kind of strange because it's really the back of the book, and I look at the acknowledgments, and something you said really stood out to me. And you talked about just about writing, and you said that your mom passed down the love of writing to you. And I'm just curious to kind of understand, how she made that impression on you.
My father's a barber. He's still alive, and he didn't read very much. And he would read the newspaper, and he kind of lived in a black and white world. Whenever he read the paper was true. And my mother was more of a book reader, and she would always encourage me to read and encourage me to write and try to really understand it, and fall in love with writing. And I did, and I fell in love with writers. And I think the writer life was something that always appealed to me. It was interesting because even though I was in pro football, I don't have any autographed jerseys. I don't have Joe Montana's jersey on my wall, I worked with. I don't have Brady's. I don't have Rich Gannon's. I don't have anybody. I have autographed books. That's my prized possession. I have every one of Robert Caro's books signed. I have, presidential books that I get signed, and I have a book signed by Ethel Kennedy. So that to me was really important, and that drove me to want to live a writer's life, which I think is the hardest life to live, but it's also the most disciplined and focused.
I love that. It's funny. I grew up collecting baseball cards,
Yeah,
and
I did that too.
yeah, as we moved and we were like married, that my wife would convince me to get rid of them, which I ended up doing. I have like a very small stash, but the only other thing I really collect now are books, and the signed ones that I don't know. I just, not that they have monetary value, they just have more meaning to me. So I love that.
Yeah, I was walking down Madison Avenue with my wife, and there was the rare bookstore, and we went in there, and the books were really, and there was a Bobby Kennedy book in there, and I fell in love with Bobby Kennedy, not how you might think somebody would idolize an individual. I was grew up a Washington Redskin fan, and when I was in the fifth grade, I had to write a report on somebody that wasn't a president. And since I was a Redskin fan and they played in RFK Stadium, RFK was the only thing I really knew, and so that's how that started. And I went in there, and there was an autographed book of Robert Kennedy, and the guy said, "Look," he said, "what you should do is buy first editions and then get the person to sign that first edition, and that'll bring value." So I have a lot of first editions signed that I followed that path, and if I could find them on eBay, if I have, like, I couldn't get Springsteen, I haven't met Springsteen yet, but I bought one of his books on online on there, or like Ben Bradley, who, I love Ben Bradley, and I thought, well, and there was a book that he had signed, so I buy those things. So I just kind of collect them. I don't know what my wife has no interest in them. My Hopefully my grandkids won't just put them on eBay and sell them for $10.
I have an addiction to that show Pawn Stars, and they have like so in Vegas, right? And so they bring in these books, and they're like first editions or like 200 years old, and then they have these like experts that come in. I just get so addicted to watching like how they judge these books. You
It's
mentioned
amazing.
Springsteen. I'd love to hear about that quote that you had in that acknowledgments, and I'm happy to read it. And you just mentioned that it was something that really kind of changed your life.
Well,
If you wouldn't mind reflecting on.
I mean, I grew up in this little beach town that Highway 9 comes through. And I'm 14 years old when he basically is on the cover of Time and Newsweek in the same week. And you're kind of taught when you grow up in this town that, you're not getting out of this town. Like, you know, and then I hear him sing Tramps Like Us, Baby, We Were Born to Run. And there's what I think I wrote in the book was there's, put a little, there's magic in the night. I mean, the faith, there's magic in the night. I believe that. And he has been the motivating force in my life, because when I saw him chase his dream, when I saw him tell his story, I thought, why can't I do that? They're no, I'm from the same area. We drink the same Jersey water, and we both have Highway 9 running through our neighborhoods, right? So like, why not? Not that I could play any music, but I wanted to chase a dream. He chased a dream. And so, that you need that. How many people that you have followed or read books about that watch the Beatles on TV? Billy Joel watched the Beatles, and Springsteen watched Elvis Presley, and then and they've watched the Beatles, and all of a sudden that just generated all these people that wanted to be entertainers.
Hmm.
So I kind of had a backwards view of it. I had somebody who kind of became very famous and got out of a neighborhood. I just said, well, if he can do it, anybody, I can do it. And I'm not going to be a singer, but I'm going to try to do what I can do. I'm not going to settle for being a barber. Not there's anything wrong with barbers. My dad's a barber, but I love football and I'm going to chase that dream.
I love that. I was thinking mathematically when Monday Night Football came out, you're roughly 11. Well, I remember
Yeah.
at that age, I was watching like wrestling, like that was my thing. And then watching sports too. And you talk a lot about Monday Night Football and the impact that has had on football in general. Like, what do you think about when you think about that time? I don't even know if like those 10, 11-year-old memories still exist, but
Oh,
how did that
God.
impact you then?
Well, first of all, I think you have to take people back in a time. One of my favorite writers is David Halberstam. And if you've ever read Halberstam's books, he always sets the scene for you of what's actually going on. One of my favorite ones that well, there's a lot of them, the best and the brightest. But the Michael Jordan book that he wrote, he basically takes Jordan as the central figure, and then he describes everything that was going on around Jordan. When we go back to 1971 on that September muggy day in Cleveland, nobody thought Monday Night Football was going to work, right? Art Modell was worried sick that nobody was going to come to the game, that the ticket booth was still the most important element of making money. And 80,000 people showed up. And what we didn't know then, back then, for any young person listening, the 70s was appointment television. You set your life around what was on TV on what night. And so, you had the TV guide next to your chair that you sat in. And, Tuesday night you were not leaving because this was on. And Thursday night. Well, America on Monday night, many people watched Gunsmoke, many people watched Andy Griffith, many people watched I Love Lucy, many people watched Rowan and Martin, Doris Day. So ABC and CBS had those programs, they had no interest in football. And ABC did because they had no programming. But what really changed the game was bowling leagues in America were the most popular thing on Mondays. Everybody got their bowling shoes, they got their bag, they put their bowling shirts on, they went to the lanes, and they had a bowling league. By the time Monday Night Football was around, bowling leagues had disappeared. People stayed home to watch the game. That's the power, and that transformed the game. And for me as a little kid growing up in this town, we couldn't see any games other than the game that was on Sunday. So when Cosell went to his highlights at halftime, it just blew your mind because I'm seeing the Washington Redskins in this uniform that I didn't know what color they were on Sunday. And I prayed that he would make them one of the five highlights. And it was a clip. It was like a little clip. And so that I think really drove the interest in the sport tremendously. Television. I mean, how did we end communism? We ended communism because people saw people that didn't have communism the way they were living. The visualization of it drove people to rebel, not the pamphlets that were dropped in. It was the visualization. Football being visual on television expanded that. That's why the chapter on TV in this book about Howard Cosell, the league owes a debt of gratitude to that man. And Brent Musburger, the league owes a debt of gratitude to that man for combining the gambling element into it as well.
Whose memoir was it? I'm just blanking on his name. The Disney CEO, the guy who came back.
Robert Iger.
Great. Have you read his memoir? Just about like
Yeah.
his, I'm
Right.
sure you already know it, but just it was, for me, it was education, learning about like his influence with football and TV. It was interesting.
It really, so like people don't understand Miller Brewing Company was a regional brewing company in Milwaukee. And the president knew the impact of Monday Night Football. He knew it. And so he bought ads on that programming. And Miller Brewing went from being a regional brewing company to a national brewing company. And then we got Miller Lite, and he started having the sports stars kind of compete. Less filling tastes great, less filling tastes great, right? And that blew up. And that's the power of visualization. I mean, one of the things I think we learn in leadership in every area is those who can tell a great story will captivate you. I mean, why does Jeff Bezos not allow PowerPoint into his presentations at Amazon? Because he wants people to tell a story to capture you. And I think the NFL told a great story, and it captures people visually.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds like they continue to do so. I wanted to reflect a little bit about like your sort of upbringing. I read that you went to a military academy, you played at Hofstra. This is, before the San Francisco 49er days. I'm just wondering, how do you think that experience, thinking back on that now, maybe set you up to be that sort of studious person by the time you got to San Francisco?
Well, I mean, I went to a military academy because I wasn't studious, right? So I went there because I had too much fun in high school, and and I thought I could do both. And I got there and I learned the power of discipline, and I learned that you got to put the effort in, you got to work. And then I went to college, and my whole focus at college, and my college roommate kind of laughs that I've written 2 books, because my whole focus when I was in college was to get a degree and get a job in football. And every weekend after our season, every Saturday, Friday, and Saturday, I would take my little Toyota Tercel and drive wherever there was a coaching clinic just to meet people and learn football. And it was great. I mean, it was tremendous. You pay whatever money I had saved, I would pay for the gas. It wasn't that expensive then. And I would pay for the admissions to the clinic. And if I had to sleep in my car, I slept in my car, and I would get up the next morning and go and learn football.
Wow. How did you get the break at UNLV? Like, how did that work?
Well, I worked at one of those clinics. So, there was there used to be called the Coach of the Year Clinic in Atlantic City. And as I look out my window, I could see Atlantic City from here. And they had the Coach of the Year Clinic. And my mother always had a glass of the Coach of the Year Clinic, which had Vince Lombardi's name on it. And somebody gave it to her as a gift to me. And I went to that clinic in 1980. I was a student at Hofstra, and I was, trying to meet as many people. And I met a man by the name of Harvey Hyde, who was the head football coach at Pasadena City College. And he took a liking to me, and he took me to lunch, and I just went and just did as much as I could, wrote him letters. And then one day I was walking from my dorm room on the campus of Hofstra to the weight room. And when I got there, I read the New York Times, and we used to have to read the transaction section of the New York Times to see what's going on. We didn't have the ticker below our TV or Twitter to figure out what was going on, right? So I read that, and Harvey Hyde was just named the head coach at UNLV football. But holy shit, here's my chance. And I called him, and he finally called me back in my dorm room, and he offered me a job for no money if I drove out there, and he'd give me room and board if I would work for free, and I did.
Wow. That's amazing. I never knew that.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I did. And I spent, my first salary was, I think, $6,000. My second salary was 9,000. And then 1984, I finally got hired full time by the 49ers, and they paid me 20,000.
Okay. So UNLV eventually paid you. It's
Yeah,
good to know.
eventually.
Oh man. Okay. You get to the Niners, you're what? You're roughly like 25 years old at this point.
25, yeah. I just turned 25.
Okay. I mean, I could talk to you for hours, right? But I just
Go
want to
ahead.
try to distill this a little bit. When you think of Bill Walsh, because I think of you as like a student of the game, like not a regular, former GM. I just think of you as a student, like at the core. And then I think of your time with Bill Walsh. I'm sure there's other people that were really influential in that organization. But when you think of your time with him, how do you feel like, looking back, maybe he's influenced you as a continuous student of the game?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Bill was like a father to me. Not that he was maternal to me, But when your parents aren't with you anymore, you still remember what they tell you every day. When your parents aren't around you, they brought you up a certain way that like my mother's been gone for 13 years. And every day I think about something she would have said to me or something she's instilled in me, right? To me, that was Walsh. Like he's still instilled in me. Like he's a part of me. I learned so much from him. And I was aware enough to know how great he was that I was able to observe him and see things. A lot of us just see, we don't observe. If you ask somebody how many steps they climb up to get into their office, they couldn't tell you. You ask Sherlock Holmes that, and he would tell you because he sees and observes. So I was observant, and I knew he was great, and I was fortunate enough to live in a time when there was no cell phones, there was no satellite radio, there was no ways, there was nothing. So when you got in a car with him, you had his attention. And sometimes he didn't want to talk, sometimes he just talked. I didn't ask questions. And that to me was like he raised me. And my biggest regret in life is I left him too early. I still regret that every day. I think about that. I should have stayed at the 49ers and stayed there 10 more years because I thought naively, I thought I could learn more. I thought I could learn even more going somewhere else. And what I found was what he told me in 84 was, this league isn't the best and the brightest. Not everybody's Bill Walsh. I learned that the hard way.
Wow. I can't compare like my career, but I think about like how many great managers have I worked for? It's, less than half a hand. I can think about it. And the first time I was so young and naive, I didn't understand that it doesn't really last that long.
Yeah.
And by the time I had the second one, he ended up retiring. And I knew that like, all right, it's got to be a different situation. But that's super fascinating to hear that, reflecting on it. Um, I'm sure there's so
We
much
we
that,
we let
we've learned.
I let
Yeah.
ambition get in the way of knowledge. And
Yeah.
I think anytime you let ambition get in the way of your knowledge, you're going to regret that. And I speak to that as someone who did. I wanted to get ahead. I wanted to have a family. I had a wife. I wanted to have kids. Bay Area was expensive. When all those things were just trivial, we could have done all that had we stayed in the Bay Area. But and I would have been smarter had been around them more. I became more experienced because I got to do things, which helped
Yeah.
me. But I would have been smarter.
There's a couple guys on those teams that you were probably around that cracked your top 10 list.
Mm.
Which is pretty cool in general to comb through the list. Was there anything that you reflect on from some of the players around that time when you were there that you think like these are some attributes, like if you've got these as you're like assessing players, like
Yeah, oh
these are
yeah.
some of them from those days with the
I
49ers?
mean, Ronnie Lott to me, had the will to win. He had this incredible competitive spirit that you don't find very often in players. Every day was important to Ronnie. St. Joe was quiet but competitive. And the one thing I learned being around that team is how much the team liked one another. There was no infighting. Everybody knew their roles. Everybody understood the roles. Walsh explained the roles, and everybody was really very kind. I was a low level employee, and they treated me like gold. Dwight Clark, Joe Montana. I mean, if I went up to Joe and asked him to sign anything, he didn't care. He was, yeah, no, whatever you need, man. I learned the kindness, and that camaraderie of team. There was a sense of belonging. Owen Eastwood wrote a great book called Belonging about how to bring organizations together, how to have to create a sense like the 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 legacy team, the not
Mhm.
the I'm skipping on the word, the team, the rugby team, and the All Blacks. And so, I mean that's tremendous. I didn't know anything about how to create a team, how to have a sense of belonging, how to create a culture environment. All that was right in front of me. I didn't know that. I didn't really know that. I know it now. When I reflect back on it, I'm like, holy shit, that's why we won. That's why we were
Yeah.
good. Players cared. They knew their roles. Bill held everybody accountable. There was one guy working the team. It was great.
I was watching the last Hard Knocks, and one of the coaches said like one of the attributes is how much do you give a shit? Like a lot or a little. I just never heard it said that way. And I got to thinking about some of the portions of your book where you talk about the culture aspect, like the fact that the Steelers have only had a few coaches for so many years. Um, it's mind blowing to see that. Obviously, those 49er
Yeah,
teams were great. I'm sure some of the other stints, maybe you noticed cultures that weren't as developed.
yeah, a
Um,
lot.
yeah, I think the last time you and I were in the same place was January 19th, 2003. I had half my face painted black and silver during the AFC Championship game.
Mhm.
When you think about like, your time in Oakland, do you feel like, I guess a few things come to mind in terms of questions. One, I'd love to hear a little bit out if you engage with John Madden, but I was also thinking, just like for the span of time that you had there, do you feel like some of the lessons that you gleaned from the other teams that you worked for kind of came together? Because that was an amazing run for those number of
Yeah.
years.
So the reason I wanted to work for Al Davis, the reason I studied Al Davis and became fascinated with Al Davis is because I was driving Bill Walsh one day in a car and he told me the most football he ever learned was working for Al Davis. And I thought, bingo, I got to go work for that guy. I got to learn that. I got to learn as much as Bill learned. So I learned a lot. I learned a lot about football. As I write in the beginning of my book, he taught me that you can't work in the NFL. You have to live in the NFL. And I think in anybody who's successful in any profession, Robert Iger at Disney or, whomever it is, you got to live in the profession. That doesn't mean you take it home with you, but you have to devote your time and understand it. The passion that Al had for the love of for the team, the way he branded the Raiders. He used to say all the time to me, "It doesn't matter where we play, we'll always be the Raiders." Like the White House, the president. The is the key word, not anything else. And the Raiders were built on you talk about sense of belonging. The colors come from the Army Black Knights of Earl Blake, and the silver of the Detroit Lions, which we'll see tonight on TV, which they've destroyed their uniforms. I mean, they have one of the great uniforms of all time, and they've destroyed them. But that being said, I mean, he had such a great sense of it. I was at the University of Michigan a couple of weeks ago, and I was with Jim Harbaugh, and his assistant was sitting there, and it was a man. And I said, "Do you have any idea how you got your job?" And the kid looked at me like, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Do you understand why you're in this role?" And he said, "No." And I said, "The reason you're in this role is because when Al Davis was a young man and he would read about the great general managers of baseball, he grew up in Brooklyn and he loved the Brooklyn Dodgers and he loved the Yankees. And the Oakland Raiders are modeled after those two teams. The speed of the Dodgers, the power of the Yankees, size, speed. Okay. And George Weiss was the general manager of the Yankees. And he did not believe in having traveling secretaries that were female. He thought it would affect the team, could cause problems, all those things. So traveling secretary for the Yankees were a male. Well, when Al Davis built the Raiders, the assistant coach, the head coach's assistant, was a male. That's how he got his job. There was no females on the football side, and that
Wow.
came from George Weiss. And so that's what I try. How we got here. How did we get here? And I think it's important to understand how we get to where we are. If you can't figure out how we got here, how are we going to get away? How are we going to get somewhere else?
Yeah. Wow. Even someone, at my age who's watches football all the time, I mean, even in that first section, when you talk about like how the T formation came to be, like I knew the name Paul Brown, but I didn't really know like
Yeah.
what he brought to the game. Um, it's like the Wikipedia of the NFL. Like that really hasn't been told in that way. But that's a
Well,
great point.
the NFL does a really bad job of honoring our past. Like we should have the Paul Brown Award for the best coach of the league. We should name all the awards after the great coaches. We should honor the executive. The executive of the year award should be named after like the combine should be named after. Nobody liked the
Yeah.
combine more than Al Davis, right? He sat there in the front row with his white or his black. It should be the Al Davis Memorial Combine. It should be named after people that really impact the game.
Yeah.
And yet we don't let that happen. And that's why we don't have a sense of belonging. That's why we have such a disconnect between today, where people think in the media that Joe Montana is not a top 5 quarterback, because we don't connect the past.
I grew up a Niners fan in New Jersey, and my sister was a huge like LT fan. And I didn't, back then you're a kid, you just hate Steve Young, right? But that documentary on Montana was mind blowing. It was such
Yeah,
I learned so much about his time at Notre Dame. Like I didn't know how clutch he was. But we need
right.
those kinds of documentaries to remind people.
We do. And, I tell a great story in the book. I don't think very many people know this story at all. But the morning of that draft, when Joe came out in 1979, Bill Tobin, who was the general manager of the Chicago Bears, he's running the draft for the Bears. He kisses his wife goodbye in the morning of that draft. And she says to him, she says, "Now you promise me we're going to draft Joe Montana." And he says, "I promise you, if he's there in the third round, we'll pick him." And he went off to work. And the third round came, and I could never get it confirmed why they didn't. But Willie McClendon, the running back from Georgia, became the Bears pick. And I think 7 picks later, Joe Montana became a 49er. Now, what would have happened had that been reversed? It'd been interesting to see. What I can tell you is Joe would have been great no matter where he went, because Joe was great. Joe could have gone to North Carolina State on a basketball scholarship. Joe was just a guy who had quiet competitiveness and unbelievable ability to make the right play at the right time.
Yeah. Wow. I know you wrote about this a little bit. Did you go to a lot of the combines in person?
Everyone, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
I have every
89.
combine. I have
Oh, go
every
ahead.
combine book. I have every combine book on my computer. I went to every one, other than the times I wasn't in the league. But yeah, I went to the '89 one for sure. I was
You
there.
you wrote a little bit about Deion Sanders. Was that like an obvious like thing when you saw him back then, or is that like okay, he was quick, but nobody knew?
No, no, he was pretty. Great players are easy to scout, right? They're easy to scout, but
Tell me
it's
about
the
that.
good ones. It's the good ones that lure you into thinking they're great. They're just really good. It's very hard to evaluate really good or good, separating those two. It's not hard to evaluate great. It's just
Okay.
not hard to evaluate great. Great is consistent. Great stands out. Great is easy to identify. He was great. He changed, as Al Davis used to say, he tilts the field. He would tilt the field in your favor. Those are hard to find. That to me was what the Hall of Fame should be about, players that tilt the field. This is
Mm.
why I wrote the book. And I don't mean to be disparaging to any player who's in the Hall of Fame. Tommy McDonald, the wide receiver who got in the Hall of Fame from the Philadelphia Eagles, was a return guy. He had 65 career touchdowns. He got traded for a kicker. He's in the Hall of Fame, but Randy Moss and him are completely different players, right? They're completely different Hall of Famers. They both have gold jackets, but there's no Randy Moss is elite. It didn't take long to figure that out. And so I wanted to kind of try to help us understand what elite looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds like that's the part of the purpose of the book is like to bring some objectivity to all of this, right? To
Yes.
coaches that didn't get, I mean, think about like George Seifert. Like, what do you think was the biggest misconception about him?
I think first of all, that anybody could steer the ship. He just took over for Walsh, so anybody could steer the ship, right? That's A. B, when he went to Carolina, and I have one of the things in the book I talk about is my second stint's killing my first stint. When you don't win somewhere else, it kills your chance. Oh, we're right. He left San Francisco. Well, what the writers who vote on this don't understand, it's hard to recreate a culture like San Francisco had. It's really hard. It's challenging. It doesn't come. Those pieces are hard to put together. I mean, look, I think Walsh would be honest enough to tell you that if he would have started out 2-4, 2-12, 2-12 his first 2 years today, he wouldn't have made it to year 3.
Mm. Do you think it's also difficult to take a team like that, insert a new leader, and expect them to follow through and respect that new leader like they did. Like it's not easy, right? Like it could be equally as difficult. Or what do you
It could
think?
be challenge. Well, that what's the old, that we didn't. You're making us do it something different. It's what I call remember when. A lot of colleges have what I call remember when programs. And Alabama, before Nick Saban got there, was a remember when school. Indiana basketball is a remember when school. They remember when they won, and they want to do everything that they did when they won. They're very, very protective of change. I mean, everybody that would go into the Miami Dolphins to try to change the program down there, including Jimmy Johnson, would be told, Shula didn't do it this way.
Yeah.
Shula didn't use computers, and we won all these games down here. Well, yeah, I mean, but times are changing.
Yeah. Was there an assessment or a draft pick where you were like really proud of it? Like, hey, like nobody knew this person was great. They weren't tilting the field, but hey, through your assessment, this was one that worked out. I'm wondering what's one that worked out and maybe what's one that maybe you regretted. Like, hey, this one
Yeah, well,
was
there's a
off.
lot I regret. I can tell you that. Any scout who tells you about all his great picks before he tells you about his shitty ones is a bad scout. A lot of regret. I think the one that, and this is a regret and a great pick. So when we had a chance to pick Warren Sapp in Cleveland in '95, and we didn't because we had bad information. But we traded down and we got a lot of stuff from the 49ers. And we're sitting there at this pick in the bottom of the first round, and we were either going to take Curtis Martin or Craig Powell. And we loved Curtis Martin, but we convinced ourselves he would be there in the third round. And we took Powell, who we didn't think would be there. And so, that was one of those mistakes where you think, oh my God, how did I do that? There's, guys like, I'll take Rob Burnett, a defensive lineman from Syracuse who we drafted in Cleveland in 1989, fifth round pick. Everybody hated him at Syracuse, said he was a malcontent. We took him. He's never going to be in the Hall of Fame, but he was a tremendous player, really helped us quite a bit. The great Charles Haley, we picked him in the fourth round. Nobody knew about Charles Haley. Nobody knew about Charles Haley. I found him playing in a tape, and Walsh, classic Walsh. People think that finding talent is searching aimlessly through the phone directory. I tell people all the time that the FBI doesn't open up the phone directory to look for serial killers. They have a profile. Well, Walsh had a profile. He called me into his office one day and he said, I want you to go downstairs and I want you to go through all the reports. Because again, we're not on computer here. This is 86. And I want you to read every report. I want you to go through all the defensive linemen, and I want you to find guys that are 6'3" and above, that weigh 240 pounds and above, that have the potential to be a pass rusher. So I went down there and I found two guys. I found Charles Haley, 6'4", 245, played at James Madison. And then I found this kid, Romel Andrews from Tennessee Martin. He was like 6'5", 245. So now I've got to wait for the tape to come in. I got to wait for the 16 millimeter tape to come in to watch it, but see if they can pass the test. So I watched the tape and I said, Coach, I think we need to watch these two guys. So he brings the whole staff upstairs to the staff room. We turn the tape on and we watch one play of Charles Haley, and Bill shuts off the projector and says, do we need to see any more of this guy? And everybody said, no, Coach, that's it. And we drafted him in the fourth round. And now he's in the Hall of Fame.
That's amazing. Wow. I wanted to just touch on this point I thought was an inflection point. I think you were in between jobs in the NFL, and the Rams had an assignment for you to basically, if I'm getting this right, they wanted to understand like what are the attributes of a great coach? Am I thinking
Yes,
about it right?
that's right. Yeah.
So when you think about the list of coaches that you have in the book, there's sort of top 10 lists that you have: Chuck, Noll, Shula, Landry, all these coaches. What are some of the attributes of that top 10 do you think kind of came through in that study that you did years prior?
It's funny, and this will serve time immemorial. Uh, we may change as a society in terms of the kids. Technology will change. The generations change. How we lead won't change. And every leader, going back to the Roman legions, to today has to have these four qualities to be great. And these gentlemen that are in my top 10 ought to have them. Every great coach has them. Deion Sanders, for all the earrings and the hat and the prime and all the stuff that people get confused about, he's got these four things. And here's what they are. The first one's called command of attention. And that means you've got a plan. Now, when Steve Jobs walks back into Apple the second time, he said to everybody in the building, they didn't want to bring him back, by the way. They had to bring him back. The company was going bankrupt. So what he did was he commanded their attention and he said, look, we have 25 products out on the market. Unless we have products that are insanely great, they're coming off the market. We're only going to focus on what can be insanely great. All great leaders have a plan, right? His job was insanely great. The second area of leadership is called management of meaning. You can explain your plan, and you have to do it in simplistic terms. You use metaphors. You use kind of stories to tell what your plan is. Here's where we're going. Here's why, and let me lead you there. And let me do it in a way to where I can kind of cultivate you. Deion does this brilliantly. This one, Deion could be he could coach a football team on Saturday and be the minister on Sunday. I mean, he's good at that. He's got that ability. The third area is called management of meaning, which is essentially management of the process, right? Who are we? What do we believe in? And am I going to manage that all the time? Right? I mean, am I going to be able to manage that? And so, and then there's management of trust, which is really the process. So management of trust is you have to trust me that I'm going to do what's right for the program. I'm going to hold you accountable. I'm going to hold the guy next to you accountable. There's not going to be double standards on this, right? And the fourth area is management of self, that I'm going to be disciplining myself, that my ego is not going to get in the way of what I'm doing. Like, it's not going to be about me. It's going to be about the team.
What's the hardest one to, you think, to get?
I think the hardest one to get is management of self. I think people's egos tend to get in the way, especially when winning happens. When winning occurs, there's a sense of comfort that enters the program. And that comfort creates, my ego's here. Management of attention is easy. You got a plan, meaning you can explain it. Trust is just the implementation of the plan. You got to trust me to know I'm going to do it. But here's what happens. Here's how you lose trust. If you say, this is the rules, and then some player breaks the rules or doesn't fall within the culture, they're going to lose the trust of the other players, right? When Parcells got out of bed in the morning, he was looking for confrontation. He wanted to confront anybody who was going to mess with his culture. Same with Walsh, same with Belichick, same with all those guys on that list. If you want to hold people accountable, you cannot be a leader. You cannot be a leader. Accountability, but you got to trust that I'm going to be fair in the accountability. And you got to hold, and so management of self is I'm holding myself accountable too.
I remember like Pat Lancioni, the author, leadership author, he said, so on some of the best teams, the teammates hold each other accountable, right? If
That's right.
Steph does something, Clay could say something rather than Kerr. Do you think that plays a role in it as well? So it's not just the coach, but teammates?
Well, that's when you have a sense of belonging, when everybody buys into it. The All Blacks have their 17 codes of conduct. They all buy into it. Everybody accepts it because it came before them. They're not the first time they're doing it. They don't just clean the sheds because it's their motto. It's the motto of the program. That's why you have to sell history. That's why you have to tell a story about whether you sell ice cream at the corner deli or whether you run an NFL team. There's a story behind what you're doing. People like stories.
That's awesome. Did you engage with John Madden a lot when you worked for the
Not
Raiders?
much. No,
Okay.
he was not around as much as you would think. He was on the road quite a bit. I think he and Al talked on the phone, but not a lot of him.
Okay. I was just curious.
But his impact on the game is tremendous. I wrote about that as well. I mean, there's a store in Louisiana that every Thanksgiving is selling boatloads of Traductin because of John Madden.
Yeah. I feel like from the view of the fan, he was so instrumental between him calling the games. I used to like, I just remember when I was younger, I had one of those like VHS recorders attached to my TV, and I would record Monday Night Football because I couldn't like be there. And I mean, those are the tapes, those VHS tapes I would like rewatch
Yeah.
over and over again. And then obviously through the video game was pretty amazing. When you think of a few other leaders, I know we really haven't talked much about Belichick, but I was just curious from like a Belichick
Well,
perspective.
When I wrote that report, I told them to hire Belichick, and they laughed at me. Belichick's great in all areas. He's not, the problem with Bill is
Do you
the
think he gets a
media
bad
does.
rap, like a little bit, like
Oh, of
on the
course, they
outside?
don't even
Yeah,
know him.
yeah.
He's one of the greatest friends you could ever have in your life. And the way the media talks about him, you think he's just some kind of, it's ridiculous. But that's I think what you learn in life. I learned this from Al Davis quite a bit. Is everything has an agenda behind every story that you read.
Hmm.
And I tell the story all the time. Lyndon Johnson, in one of Robert Caro's books, talks about when he was the president, he called Ben Bradley at home at 6:30 in the morning, and he said, "I have two questions for you. There's two articles on the Post today that I don't know who the sources are from the article, and because the one guy was in the hospital and the other guy was out of the country, so who's the two new sources?"
Oh man.
He used to sit at his desk with a red pen and circle it and know who the sources were. You can read any column today and figure out who the source is.
Yeah.
That's what I do when I read stuff online. I who is the source behind this article?
Yeah. I feel like anything you read online, you've got to like completely sift through these days.
You got to divide by 4.
Right. There's this quote that I don't know if you truly had it in your office, but as if you don't like change, you'll like irrelevancy even less. I'm wondering,
Yeah,
like,
I still have that card.
do you
In
really?
fact, I still do. Yeah, I just was going through my desk at my other office downtown here in Ocean City. Yeah, of course I do. That I got that from Tom Peters. That was from Eric Shaninsky of the United States Army. I think that's really true. If you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less. It's hard for people to change. It's hard for Al Davis to change. It really was, because he was so good at dominating an era that he got away from his comfort zone, you know, and it was hard for him to keep up and change and modify. And when I say change, I don't mean your values. I mean how you get to where your values are. People think change is okay. McDonald's is going to start selling pizza today. They're keeping up with the times. No, that's not change. How they present their burgers, how they handle their store, how they can do different things. That's the change that has to be implemented. The Raiders, change how we drafted certain positions, change how we viewed this.
Hmm.
That's the change I'm talking about. People see change as, okay, we're going from black uniforms to green. No, no, no. That's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Was there something you would have wanted to do differently while you were there?
Oh yeah, I mean, we needed to revamp the whole entire scouting department. We were working in 1960. We were not technologically sound. We had people that were not collecting data. It was we didn't have a grading system. We just talked about players. It was everything that you could do to not have a good draft. But he had run drafts because he was ahead of his time, and he was working without he was working with a limited. Everybody had limited film, and he had an eye for talent. He had a great eye for talent, and yet when the game changed, we didn't keep up with it. We didn't, we were still we still had what we call books, and so all the reports went in books. And so when a player got cut, he went from one book to the other book. I mean, how ridiculous! That's what
Yeah.
computers are for.
So the grading system that you developed didn't get carried over into Oakland?
Oh no, I couldn't. You couldn't implement that. It was his program. He wasn't going to
Okay.
read that. He wasn't going to look at what a 6G30 was. He could care less about that. That wasn't his thing. And because it wasn't his thing, he didn't really want to learn about it.
Wow.
You
Okay.
need a grading system he had his own grading system, size, speed. So if a guy didn't run fast and a guy wasn't fit the size for the position, he wasn't interested.
Okay. And we got a couple minutes. I was just thinking about your list. It's 100 players. We can talk about Tom Brady for another hour, but are there a couple attributes that you feel like from a player perspective, like, hey, you mentioned like Ronnie Lott. from the 49er days and his competitiveness. Are there any other kind of attributes that you felt like guys in your top 10, some of which, LT, I think was number 2, one
Yeah.
being Tom Brady. Are there a couple commonalities between your top 10? You feel like, hey, these guys, they've got these.
Well, I think all the great players, all the 25 guys in my elite level, all have the ability, have great ability and great work ethic. Like they had the God gave them talent, but like Kobe and like all great players, they were going to work hard to extract that talent. They weren't just going to rely on their talent. I think that's where Dion shows you now as a coach at Colorado. He's willing to work hard. I think one of the unsung players in my top 25 is Roger Staubach. I think he was incredible, and he was a guy that won. He was a great teammate. He worked hard. He was talented. He didn't play, he had to go serve in the arm in the Navy, but I think he was really, really, he exemplified all those things that I talked about.
Why do you think he like doesn't get the credit, like in terms of being unsung?
Yeah, because he's so quiet. Nobody really, he didn't self promote. A lot of the guys didn't self promote. I mean, but he was great. I mean,
Yeah.
Otto Graham, he's not with us any longer, but but these guys had that unique ability to play great under pressure.
Yeah. It's so many of these guys, like we don't really, I mean, I'm 40, but like I never got to see these guys. And
No, no, but that's the power of YouTube now. You can go back and watch them. So
yeah,
you can watch. I mean, they're all on YouTube. It's amazing, and you can see it. But I think to me, you got to put it in perspective. I think that one of the benefits that I had writing this book was what comes from Halberstam actually about when I read his books. He always puts you in the time and place. If you read The Coldest Winter about the Korean conflict, you basically feel like you have lived in Korea. He
yeah,
describes the elements to you. When he writes about the 50s, he gives you really a portrait. I think to understand the past players, you got to understand the era.
yeah.
And we don't do that. We don't spend enough time on that.
Do you hope that like, writers and like part of the book, like, do you hope they look at this in terms of the Hall of Fame and say, hey, like these are some, guardrails we should actually be considering? Like, is that part of
I'm
the
hoping
plan?
so. Yeah, I hope so. I'm hoping some of the people on the Hall of Fame committee will read it. I'm hoping they'll say, hey, they'll put it in a column and say it. Now, I know the NFL, and I know whenever you have a divergent idea, people tend to not want to. I'm waiting to see if that happens. I mean, I think my book will sell well enough that it should get some attention by the national media. But if it doesn't, even though it's selling well, I'll know that they don't want change.
Yeah. What did you learn most when all
A
was said and done
lot.
and was published?
I learned that I didn't know anything. I learned that the players from the past have a place today. I learned everything about each individual player that I wrote up. And I learned that the power of telling stories is really what it's most about.
Yeah.
And I knew that I fell in love with Springsteen because he told me a story. And today at 73, he's still telling stories. That's a powerful tool.
Yeah. Wow. Was there an unsung hero in terms of the book, like someone that you went back and forth with on your top lists or, some of the
The unsung
criteria?
hero in my book, the unsung hero in my book is Kenny Washington. He ranks
Mm,
100. He never really played very good football. He's not a top 100 player. He's a top 100 individual because we would not have football in Los Angeles if it wasn't for Kenny Washington. Kenny Washington, the only reason he played for the Los Angeles Rams when they moved from Cleveland is because the city of Los Angeles would not approve the Rams to play in the Coliseum unless they had an African American player on the team. The NFL had their
wow.
blackout period, and it really ranged from about, I would say it ranged from the 30s to 1946. Very few African American players were able to play in the league. And when Kenny Washington broke that barrier by joining the Rams, now he was done as a player, hurt his knee twice in semi-pro football, but he was a better player than Jackie Robinson. They both played at UCLA. They both played football together. People talk about Kenny Washington in reverence, but unfortunately, he got banned because of George Preston Marshall didn't want that because Preston Marshall felt he couldn't have any African American players on his team because the Washington football team was south of the Mason-Dixon line. And he thought that would affect his attendance and that would affect everything. Now he's in the Hall of Fame. How? I don't know. How? I don't know. There's no book that you can read that doesn't say he wasn't a racist.
Yeah.
It's
Uh,
documented, right? It's he. In fact, Hallis wanted to sign Kenny Washington, and when he was a rookie, and Marshall basically said we can't do that. So
wow.
I think Kenny Washington really, if you learn one thing about this book, it's the power of Kenny Washington and all the people around Kenny Washington that got him on that field for the Rams.
That's amazing. Last question. I know your son, both of your sons involved
Yeah, both
in
of them are
right?
there. Yeah. Yeah. I got
So
a picture over here on my wall of them when they both were kids. And one was in I think Matthew was probably in the seventh grade. Mickey probably was in ninth grade. And we're all standing on the field. I'm in the Raider stuff and he's in there too. Great.
what is Matt? Where's Matthew? What
Matthew's
is
at
he
the
doing?
Raiders too. He's assistant receiver coach there. He's helping his
Oh, they're
brother out. He
both
works for his
there.
brother. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's
Great.
amazing. So let's use your sons as the example. You're talking to your sons, they're still fairly young. They want to make an impact in this world. They want to balance work and life, right? What are some general pieces of life or career advice that you just normally impart on them that you think is important, maybe for other people to eavesdrop on?
I think the most important thing is to make sure that the people you're connecting to and you're talking to understand what you say is coaching, not criticism. Make sure they understand everything that you're saying to them is because you care and it's coaching. It's not criticism. The second thing I would tell them, and this is the most important of all, is intellectual capacity is currency. You've got to be smart. You've got to renew your intellectual intelligence every single day. And you have to prove to the players that you'll help them become better players through your intellectual makeup. Those two things. And the third thing is don't shy away from doing the right thing.
Mm.
Never do that. Never compromise doing the right thing. You do those three things really well, you're going to be a great coach.
Awesome, Mike. I appreciate the time. Is there anything we missed or anything you feel like
No, I'm good.
we want to highlight? Okay.
I'm good. I just hope people enjoy the book. You know, I've learned, one of the things I learned, I had this great mentor when I was living in Los Angeles, writing the first book, his Peter Kaufman, he runs a company called Glen Eyre. And he told me to start reading books about musical people and creative people. And that's when I started reading about Rick Rubin and all those. And Rubin has a great quote. He says, "We are in service to the work more than the audience." So when you write a book,
Mm,
you can't predict whether people are going to like it or not. But if you feel like you did a good job on it, that's all that matters.
yeah, I mean, it's honestly feels like an encyclopedia for the NFL. Like, I'm
I
like, oh my
appreciate
gosh.
that.
Like you can read
Thank you.
one of the things. There's another book I have on my desk, The Daily Dad. I'm sure you have it.
Yeah, I sure do, Brian. Yeah.
And I just leave it here because if I don't leave it on my desk, I'll forget to read it. And I just love the
Yeah.
fact that I can read a page a day and, regret yelling at my kids like the previous day. Usually often what happens. And it's the fact that like you can actually you even pick like a player or two a day and just like
Yeah.
kind of let it sink in. So I feel like it has that kind of encyclopedia value to it. Is there a book that you recommend other people read? I didn't ask you this, but I know you dropped a few names here, but is there one that like has made a big impact on you? They're like, hey, these are one or two
Oh,
books.
I mean, I think there's a lot of writers that have made a huge impact on me in my life. Uh, I think Ryan Holiday's book, The Obstacle Is the Way. After I read that book, I called him. I didn't know him at all. I called him on the phone and said, "You just wrote the best book on Bill Belichick you could write," because Marcus Aurelius is Bill Belichick. So I don't know. There's so many books. I mean, my top five books. David Marinus's book on Bill Clinton. This isn't political. This is just really going in deep into the understanding how somebody goes from Hope, Arkansas to the president. I think those are powerful lessons to learn. If you could separate your view of politics and understand the person, we have a hard time doing that.
Yep.
I think that's an incredible, that would be one of the books I would take on a deserted island. Then sometimes I'll read novels. I loved Widow for One Year by John Irving. That would probably be I would be with that on the desert island. So I have so many that I kind of and every one that I like I'll get signed.
That's
I have
awesome.
that Widow for One Year signed. Yeah.
When you write for the daily I'm blanking on the name,
Coach.
Daily Coach, yeah. Do
Yeah.
you um do you like how do we know it's you? Do you sign your name? Because I don't see like your
No, we
name
don't.
signed.
Like today Kamadi Ramsey wrote that on Dion. He's a great writer. You can tell Kamadi's a wordsmith. He writes really well. He'll write usually Thursdays and Sundays. Coach Rav writes Friday. Trevor, who's also part of our company, he'll write Tuesday and Thursday. Tuesday, I write Monday and Wednesday. You can tell mine's the simplest
Okay.
writing of them all. Mine's the simplest writing of them all. I mean, you
So,
could say Lombardi wrote that. He's barely got out of high school.
so by design, it's just, it
Yeah,
is what it is. Yeah.
it
That's
is.
cool.
But it's the greatest thing I've ever had for me because it forces you to see the world. Again, it forces you to go back to that observe, not just see. So every day something
Mm,
comes across my desk where I need to write about that. And so I keep a pad every day about, what do I want to write about? Make people understand, not remember.
mm.
The elephant rider. I think there's so many things that you come across that you just jot down. I want to write about that. And then I
What is the,
research it.
sorry, can I ask you, what's the elephant rider? What is that?
It's kind of it's a elephant rider is kind of an acronym for one of these management leaders that kind of talked about it in his book. It's Thinking Fast and Slow. Daniel Kahneman wrote about it, but another writer kind of started it.
Mm,
So I want to try to explain that, and so you just write it down, and then you start researching it,
yeah.
and then you come up with something. And for me, even the daily coach has been incredible. To work with Coach Ravlik, first and foremost, is incredible. But also to have this community that we've been able to develop. We have 35,000 email subscribers every day, and we have a 45% open rate, which is great. Now, it's not a business, but it's a great, great thing.
Yeah. It's a great pool of people. Do you study Coach K a lot by chance? Just on the
I
coaching
do. I
side of
read a
things?
lot about him. Yeah, sure do. I mean, I love the piece I read on ESPN about him. I think it was by Wright Thompson, which was a great piece. Yeah, I'm fascinated by all that.
Yeah.
Especially when you can get to the real, not the PR, the real, like you see them. And that article on Coach K when he's talking about losing his dog. Now you got me right. I'm completely in on that. My dog's 13 and she's in here every day with me. There's no I couldn't even imagine losing her. So he
Yeah.
got me on that one.
Kobe is 14 and a half.
Yeah,
Not named
God
after the
bless him.
basketball player, but yeah, no, totally. Yeah. There's so, I mean, just, there's the 40, 35,000, 50% open rate. Those are people that probably like sports, but they may not be in it and they need to lead people and they maybe
Yeah,
manage people. And so I do think it's such a valuable group of people. That's awesome. I appreciate you going over, man. This
thank
is
you
so
so
much fun
much.
for me. Thank you. So you've given me enough not to
Anytime.
screw it up from here. So I appreciate it, Mike.
Thank you.
All right.
Keep me
Thanks.
touch. Bye bye.
See ya.